The Hells Angels biker heard the little girl cry under the rain, and his violent mercy ended a predator's reign. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. On a cold, rainy night, a grizzled Hells Angels biker named Jake Razor Morrison was cruising down a quiet, rural highway. The rain hammered against his leather jacket, and the roar of his Harley-Davidson engine cut through the storm. He had spent most of his life on the road, leaving behind a trail of broken relationships and lost opportunities. He was a man hardened by years of violence, living by the code of his brotherhood, but always with an empty feeling gnawing at him inside. Tonight, as the rain pounded the pavement, he was just another soul trying to escape the darkness within. As Jake turned a sharp bend, his headlights caught something strange up ahead. There, just off the side of the road, he heard the faintest cry. It wasn't the kind of sound you expect on a desolate stretch of highway. It was the soft, terrified cry of a little girl. His instincts told him to keep going. He had no reason to stop, no obligation to help. He was a biker, not a hero. But something in that cry, that helpless, desperate plea, made him slam on the brakes. He skidded to a halt, his heart racing. As he looked ahead, his eyes landed on a small figure huddled beneath a tree. The girl was drenched, soaked to the bone, her clothes torn and dirty. She was curled up in a ball, trembling, her eyes wide with fear. Jake's heart clenched. He didn't know why, but something about her reminded him of the daughter he never had. Without a second thought, Jake dismounted his bike and rushed over to her. His leather boots splashed through the puddles as he knelt beside the trembling child. Hey, it's okay, he muttered, his voice gruff yet gentle. The girl recoiled, her eyes full of fear. As she looked up at the imposing biker, her tiny hands shook as she whispered, "Please, don't hurt me. I can't move." Jake froze. She thought he was going to hurt her. Of course she did. To her, he was just another scary figure. A man in black leather with tattoos and scars, part of a world that had never shown kindness to people like her. But as he looked at her, he saw nothing but vulnerability. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jake said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was convincing her or himself. His hands, calloused from years of hard work and violence, moved gently as he pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around her frail body. Her wide brown eyes watched him warily, but something in her expression seemed to soften. "What's your name?" Jake asked, his voice quieter now. "Lily," she whispered. "My name is Lily." He helped her sit up, cradling her small, fragile body. She had to be no older than 7 or 8. "Lily, where's your family?" Jake asked, looking around, his gaze sharp, scanning the surroundings. The girl trembled again, her lips quivering as she looked at the ground. I don't know. I ran away." Jake's heart sank. She was alone, out here, in the middle of a storm. It was clear something was wrong, but he couldn't push her for more right now. "It's okay," Jake said, though his gut twisted. "You're safe now." As he helped her stand, Lily winced in pain. Her ankle was swollen, and it was clear she had been running for some time. Jake cursed under his breath. There was no time to waste. He had to get her somewhere safe, away from whatever had caused her to run. As he lifted her into his arms, a sudden sound broke the silence. The roar of a motorcycle approaching. Jake's instincts kicked in, his eyes narrowing. He turned to see headlights piercing through the rain. Someone was coming. But who? Jake held Lily tightly as he quickly made his way through the rain, his boots splashing through puddles, his thoughts racing. He could feel her small body trembling in his arms, her face pale and full of fear. The storm was relentless, the wind howling as it pushed against them. But he wasn't about to let anything happen to this little girl. He reached his bike, crouching down to carefully place her on the back. The sound of approaching motorcycles had him tense up again. He didn't know if they were friends or foes, but he couldn't take the risk. He fastened her jacket tightly, and then looked up, eyes scanning the darkened road. The headlights grew closer. Whoever was coming wasn't slowing down. The engines roared louder, making Jake's gut tighten. He was used to the sounds of bike engines, but this one felt off, too fast, too aggressive. The figures riding the bikes loomed large in the rain-soaked night. The lead rider's headlights cut through the dark like a predator hunting its prey. Jake took a step back, shielding Lily with his own body. He'd been through enough encounters like this in his life to know the difference between a casual biker and one who meant trouble. The group pulled up, their bikes skidding to a stop in front of him. There were 4 riders, each wearing the same patches, Hell's Angels. But Jake could tell by their posture and the way they carried themselves that these weren't friends. He knew these types. They were from the same club, but they weren't his brothers. Not anymore. They were the kind of men who ruled by fear, not respect. And it was clear they weren't here for a casual visit. "What's going on here, Razor?" the lead rider asked, his voice cutting through the storm. The words stung, like a slap in the face. Jake knew that tone. It was a challenge. "None of your business, Steele," Jake said coldly, his eyes narrowing as he kept his focus on the men. His voice was calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it, a warning. "This kid's not part of whatever trouble you've got brewing. Leave her out of it." The man, Steele, didn't budge. He was bigger than Jake, more imposing, and his eyes were filled with a cruel edge. He looked at Lily, who was now clutching the back of Jake's leather jacket with shaking hands. "You think you can just bring a kid into the middle of a storm like this and not expect us to question it? She's probably running from something. You sure you're not involved, Razor?" The group chuckled darkly behind him, their laughter echoing through the rain. Jake didn't flinch, his jaw clenched tight. He was no longer part of their twisted version of the Brotherhood. He had walked away from that life, left it all behind, but they would never let him go that easily. "I'm done with all this," Jake growled, stepping forward. "Get out of my way, Steele. This kid's safe with me. If you want trouble, you'll find it, but it won't be from me." Steele's eyes flashed with something darker. "You've always had a way of talking big, Razor. But it's not going to work this time. You're a liability." The tension between them was thick, like a wire ready to snap. Jake could feel the anger rising, but he wasn't going to fight them. Not over this. Not over a child who needed protection. Steele and his gang were just looking for a reason to pick a fight. Jake wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. "You're not going to lay a finger on her," Jake said, his voice low and controlled. He stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides, the leather jacket now drenched from the rain. Steele smirked, clearly enjoying the standoff. But before he could say anything else, a voice broke through the storm. "Leave him alone." The voice was small, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of truth. Lily, still shivering, stood behind Jake, her eyes locked onto Steele's. There was something about her, something brave, something that made even the hardened men in front of them pause. Jake turned to her, surprised. "Lily," he started, but she stopped him with a simple motion. "He's not going to hurt me. He's helping me. And if you're going to hurt anyone, it should be me." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. She was just a kid, but her strength in that moment was undeniable. Steele's smile faded, replaced by something far darker. "You think we're scared of you, kid?" he spat, his tone venomous. Jake stepped forward quickly, blocking Lily from the men's view. His anger was burning now, but it wasn't just for the men in front of him. It was for what they represented. They were the same men who had caused so much pain, and now they were trying to drag this innocent child into their mess. "You don't get it, Steele," Jake said coldly. "I'm not part of your game anymore, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect this little girl. Whatever it takes." The men fell silent for a moment, the sound of rain on the asphalt the only noise between them. Then Steele stepped back, his face twisting in anger. "This isn't over, Razor. Not by a long shot." He turned to his gang. "Let's go. We'll deal with him later." The men mounted their bikes, revving their engines as they pulled away, disappearing into the storm. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He turned to Lily, who was still clinging to his jacket. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, though the fear in her eyes hadn't completely faded. "I think so," she said quietly. "Thank you for protecting me." Jake gave a small smile, the weight of his past pressing down on him. But the weight of this moment felt like it was worth everything. "You're safe now," he promised her. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you." As they stood there in the rain, the world felt a little less dark. Jake's purpose had been twisted by the violence of his past, but maybe, just maybe, he could still find redemption. And as the storm raged on around them, he knew that Lily was no longer alone. The rain finally began to ease up, but the tension in the air was far from gone. Jake had managed to get Lily into his garage, the one place he thought would be safe for the both of them. The night had been a whirlwind of emotions: fear, anger, relief. But now, in the quiet of his workshop, things felt almost normal, despite the weight of what had just happened. Jake carefully placed Lily on the couch, the same worn, leather couch that had been his only comfort for years. It was old, cracked, and stained from the countless nights he had spent here alone, thinking about the life he had chosen. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, there was someone else here. Someone who needed him. "You okay?" Jake asked softly as he knelt down in front of her. Lily was still trembling, but she had stopped crying. She nodded, though her eyes were full of uncertainty. "I think so," she whispered, her voice fragile. "I'm just scared. I didn't know where to go." Jake's heart ached as he looked at her, the small girl who had just been thrown into a world of violence and danger. He could see the fear in her eyes, and it reminded him of the fear he used to feel before he had hardened himself to everything. But something about her made him want to protect her. He had no idea how long he could keep her safe or what he would do next, but right now, in this moment, he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. "You're safe here," Jake said, trying to sound reassuring. "No one's going to hurt you." He stood up and went to the small kitchenette in the corner of the room, where a single light bulb flickered overhead. He pulled out a bottle of water and a can of soup. Something simple, something to try and give her some comfort. When he turned back, Lily was staring at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not a good person. I don't even know why I stopped." Jake hesitated. He didn't have the answer to that. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure about his own motivations. He wasn't sure why he had stopped for a little girl in the rain, why he had thrown himself into danger to protect her. Maybe it was because he had been alone for so long, or maybe it was because, deep down, he saw something in her that reminded him of the person he used to be before the club consumed him. "I'm just doing what's right," Jake said, the words sounding hollow even to him. "You don't have to understand. Just know that I'm not going to let anyone hurt you." Lily didn't speak for a moment, but she nodded, her small hands clutching the blanket that Jake had draped over her. She looked so fragile, so small in this big world. Jake felt a pang of guilt. He had spent so much of his life running away from his past, from the mess he had made of his own life. He had been part of something bigger, something that had given him purpose. But at what cost? He had left that all behind when he walked away from the Hells Angels. But tonight, everything had changed. He couldn't turn his back on Lily. He couldn't let her end up like he had, lost and broken, fighting a battle with no end in sight. The storm had calmed, but the storm inside him was just beginning. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door slamming open in the distance, followed by the roar of motorcycle engines. He froze. The sound was unmistakable. It was the same sound he had heard earlier, the same sound that had sent his heart racing. Steele and his crew were back. Jake quickly turned to Lily. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and commanding. "Don't make a sound. I'll be right back." Lily nodded, though the fear in her eyes returned. Jake didn't have time to comfort her. He had to face Steele and his men head on. He couldn't let them hurt her, and he couldn't let them take control of his life again. The door to his garage creaked as Jake pushed it open, his boots heavy against the concrete floor. His eyes narrowed as he saw the figures standing outside, their motorcycles lined up in front of the building like soldiers ready for battle. Steele was at the front, his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. "Thought you could run from us, Razor?" Steele's voice was filled with mockery, but there was something darker beneath it. "We don't forget. You know that." Jake's grip tightened on the doorframe. He was outnumbered, but he wasn't afraid. "Not anymore." "I'm not running," Jake said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I'm done with all this. You want to pick a fight, fine, but you leave her out of it." Steele laughed, a harsh, cold sound that echoed in the quiet night. "You think we're scared of you, Razor? You left the club, but the club never left you. You're still one of us, whether you like it or not." Jake clenched his jaw. He had left the club. He had walked away from that life, from the violence, from the destruction. But Steele and his crew didn't see it that way. They saw him as a traitor, a coward who had abandoned the Brotherhood. They would never let him go. But Jake wasn't going to fight them. Not for the club, not for anything. He had something else to protect now. "Lily, I'm not part of your club anymore," Jake said firmly, stepping out into the rain, his eyes locked on Steele's. "I'm not your brother. I'm not anyone's brother. but I'll die before I let you hurt her." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Steele's smirk faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "You're making a mistake, Razor. You should have stayed in the club. Now you'll regret walking away." With that, the group revved their engines, their bikes roaring to life, and just like that, they were gone. Jake stood there for a moment, the sound of their engines fading into the distance. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He had won, for now. But he knew Steele and his crew would be back. And when they returned, Jake would be ready. For Lily. The rain had stopped, but the tension in the air still lingered. Jake stood in the middle of his garage, his eyes fixed on the door where Steele and his gang had left just hours ago. He could still hear the rumbling of their engines in his mind, a constant reminder of the threat that loomed just outside his small, temporary sanctuary. He had made a promise to Lily, one that he intended to keep, to protect her, no matter the cost. As Jake turned away from the door, he glanced at Lily, still sitting on the couch, her eyes wide, her small hands clenched tightly around the blanket he had draped over her. She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of fear and gratitude. "Are they gone?" she asked, her voice soft, barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, though the truth was more complicated. "For now," he said, trying to sound reassuring, though he knew better. They would be back. He couldn't run from his past forever, and neither could Lily. She had been pulled into his world, and now there was no turning back. He couldn't let her down. Lily shifted on the couch, clearly uncomfortable. Her ankle was still swollen, and Jake could see the way she winced every time she moved. He needed to get her to a doctor, but that would have to wait. They weren't safe here yet. "You should try to sleep," Jake said, his voice gentle as he knelt beside her. "I'll keep watch. I'm not going anywhere." Lily hesitated for a moment before nodding, her tired eyes fluttering shut as she curled up under the blanket. Jake stood, watching her for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had gotten them both into. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. For the first time in years, he had someone to fight for. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, lost in thought, but eventually, the quiet was broken by a loud knock at the door. Jake's body tensed immediately. His hand instinctively reached for the knife he kept on the workbench. His eyes darted toward the couch where Lily was still resting, unaware of the threat that was just outside. Another knock, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Jake, I know you're in there. Open up." The voice was familiar, though strained with urgency. It was Pete, an old acquaintance from the club. Pete had always been one of the few who didn't share the same ruthless approach as the others. He was a mechanic, a man of few words, but his loyalty had never been in question. Jake's hand hovered over the door handle for a moment before he decided to answer. He couldn't risk leaving Pete out there in the cold, not when he was probably the only ally left from his past. Slowly, Jake opened the door, his eyes scanning the area outside. Pete stood there, his leather jacket soaked from the rain, his face grim. "It's not safe here, Razor," Pete said, his voice low. "Steele and his crew, they're looking for you, and they won't stop until they find you." Jake didn't respond at first, his gaze flicking toward the couch where Lily was still asleep. "I'm not leaving," Jake finally said, his voice firm. "I made a promise to her." Pete nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I get it, but you're not just up against them. You've got a whole lot of people after you now. You think Steele's bad? Wait until you meet the ones who want what's in your head. They don't care about the club, Razor. They care about control." Jake's heart sank at the thought. He had been part of something much bigger than the Hells Angels, something that reached deeper into the shadows. He had left that world behind, but it seemed that the world wasn't done with him yet. "I'm not running," Jake said, his voice cold. "I'm not going anywhere." Pete studied him for a moment before his eyes flicked to Lily, still asleep on the couch. "You've got a good heart, Razor, but that's going to get you killed if you're not careful." Jake clenched his jaw. He didn't need Pete to remind him of the danger. He had seen what happened when people got too close to him, when they became a part of his life. It never ended well, but this time was different. Lily wasn't just someone he could walk away from. He couldn't leave her to fend for herself. Not again. "I'll protect her," Jake said, his voice unwavering. Pete nodded slowly, his eyes flicking to the shadows outside. "I believe you, but you're not alone in this anymore, and you need to be ready." With that, Pete turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. Jake closed the door quietly behind him, locking it, and turning to look at Lily again. He knew the next few hours would be critical. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew one thing for sure. He would fight to keep her safe, no matter the cost. As the storm raged outside, Jake prepared himself for the battle ahead. He didn't know how long he could protect Lily, but he would make sure that, for as long as she was with him, she would never be alone. Jake paced the floor of the garage, his mind racing. The silence of the night seemed to stretch endlessly, each tick of the clock echoing through the empty space. He had made his decision. He wasn't going to run anymore. Steele and his crew weren't going to intimidate him into abandoning Lily. But he knew the danger wasn't over. They would be back, and with them, a whole new level of threats. As he turned his thoughts over and over, Jake couldn't help but feel a weight pressing down on his chest. He had made promises to Lily. He was her protector now, and he had no idea what he was doing. The sound of a soft cough broke his train of thought. Lily had woken up, her small face peeking over the couch. Her eyes were still full of the same fear, but there was something else now too, something like trust. She had started to rely on him, and that made Jake's heart tighten. He had never been anyone's protector before. Not like this. Not with his past. He turned toward her, forcing a smile. "Hey, kid," he said softly, walking over to her. "You feeling any better?" Lily nodded, but it was clear she wasn't just asking about her ankle. She had that look in her eyes, the same look that told Jake she wasn't going to just sit there and wait for someone else to take care of things. "What now?" she asked, her voice quiet but strong. "We wait," Jake said, his tone more confident than he felt. "We stay here, and we stay safe." But the more he said it, the more he realized how little he believed his own words. The storm had passed, but another one was on the horizon. Jake didn't know how to keep her safe. He didn't know how to protect her from the darkness he had spent years running from. But he couldn't leave her. Not now. Not after everything. "What if they come back?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake swallowed hard, his gaze locking onto hers. He didn't want to lie to her. He didn't want to give her false hope. But he had to keep her from breaking, from succumbing to fear. "If they come back," Jake said, his voice steady, "we fight." Lily looked at him, her wide brown eyes searching his face. She could tell he wasn't afraid, but she was. "You're not afraid?" she asked. Jake hesitated. It wasn't the right time to tell her about his own fears, the ghosts that had haunted him for years. He wasn't afraid of Steele, or his crew, but he was afraid of losing her. He was afraid of failing. "I've been through worse," Jake finally said, shrugging off his fear. "I've fought for a lot of things in my life. But this is different. This time, it's not about me. It's about you. And I'm not going to let anyone hurt you." Lily gave him a small, tentative smile. The kind that made Jake feel like maybe he wasn't as lost as he thought. Maybe he still had a chance to be something more than the broken man he had been. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the storm still heavy in the air. Jake glanced out the window, scanning the street for any sign of trouble. The rain had stopped, but the night still felt dark. He knew they weren't safe. Not yet. Not until he figured out who was really behind Steele's crew and why they were after him. The door to the garage suddenly creaked open, and Jake's hand instinctively went to the knife tucked into his waistband. But it was only Pete. Pete's face was grim as he stepped inside, his jacket soaked from the rain. "You're still here," Pete said, his voice low. "You know it's not safe. They won't stop until they get what they want." Jake didn't respond immediately. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to hear about what he had left behind, what he had walked away from. He didn't want to hear about how much trouble he was in. "I can't leave," Jake finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not now? Not after everything." Pete studied him for a moment before nodding. "I get it," he said, "but you can't keep running. It's not just about you anymore. If Steele and his guys want you, they'll keep coming. And they won't stop." Jake's fists clenched at his sides. "I know," he said, his voice tight, "but I can't let them have her. I won't." Pete let out a long sigh, running a hand through his wet hair. "You're right about that. But there's more to this than just Steele. You've got bigger problems on your hands, Razor. And if you want to keep her safe, you're going to have to face them head on." Jake didn't say anything. He didn't need to hear the rest of it. He knew. The shadows of his past were closing in on him. And now, they were threatening to drag Lily into it. He couldn't let that happen. "We're in this together," Jake said, looking at Pete. "I'm not leaving. And I'm not letting her go." Pete looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll help. But you've got to be ready." This isn't going to be easy. Jake turned to look at Lily, still sitting on the couch, her eyes wide, but determined. We'll make it through, he said, more to himself than to Pete. We have to. The night felt colder now, the weight of the decision heavy in the air. Jake didn't know what was coming next, but he knew one thing for sure. He would fight for her. He would fight to the end. And no matter what happened, he wouldn't let anyone tear apart the only thing that mattered to him now. Lily. Jake paced back and forth in the garage, the weight of Pete's words hanging heavy in the air. The storm had passed, but the danger had not. The knock at the door earlier had only been the beginning. Steele and his crew were part of something bigger, something darker. Jake had known that when he walked away from the Hells Angels, but he had never anticipated being dragged back into the chaos. He couldn't lose Lily. Not now. Not after everything. He needed to protect her, and to do that, he had to face the past he had tried so hard to escape. The sound of the rain had stopped, but the night felt darker than before. The quiet in the garage was suffocating, the ticking of the clock marking each passing second. Jake ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling up inside him. He didn't know what he was supposed to do next. He had no plan, no backup. He had always relied on his brothers in the past, but now, he had no one. He glanced over at Lily, still curled up on the couch, her face pale from the fear of the night. She had been through so much already, and yet, she still trusted him. That trust weighed heavily on him. He couldn't let her down. Not now. You don't have to do this. Pete's voice cut through Jake's thoughts, pulling him back to reality. Jake looked up to see Pete standing in the doorway, his face grim. You don't have to face this alone. I've got your back. Jake stared at Pete for a long moment, considering his words. Pete wasn't the same man he used to know. He had always been loyal, but this was different. Jake had walked away from everything, including Pete, but now, Pete was offering him a lifeline. A lifeline Jake wasn't sure he deserved. Thanks, Jake muttered, his voice hoarse. But I can't drag you into this. Pete shrugged, his face set with determination. You don't have to drag me anywhere. I'm in this because I choose to be. I've got a debt to pay, and I'm not letting you do this alone. Jake swallowed hard, the lump in his throat threatening to choke him. He didn't deserve anyone's loyalty, but Pete was giving it to him anyway. The thought made him sick. And yet, in the pit of his stomach, there was a flicker of something else. Hope. He hadn't felt that in years. We need to figure out who's behind this, Jake said, his voice stronger now. Steele's crew is just the beginning. There's something bigger going on. I'm not going to let them hurt Lily. I won't. Pete nodded, his expression serious. We'll get through this, he said, his voice firm. But we need to be smart about it. You're not just up against Steele. You're up against a whole network of people. They won't stop until they get what they want. Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had to find a way to protect Lily, to keep her safe. But the more he thought about it, the more it seemed impossible. The people he had left behind were still out there, and they wouldn't let him go. I've got to make a move, Jake said, more to himself than to Pete. I can't just sit here and wait for them to come after us. Pete gave him a pointed look. And where are you going to go? The road's not safe, Razor. You need a plan. A real plan. Jake nodded slowly. Pete was right. He couldn't just keep running. The past wasn't going to let him go that easily. He had to face it, no matter how much he wanted to stay hidden. We need to find out who's pulling the strings, Jake said. Steele's just a pawn. There's someone bigger behind this. Someone who's pulling the strings. We've got to find them before they find us. Pete crossed his arms, looking thoughtful. You think it's the same people who've been after you all these years? Jake didn't respond at first. The question lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of everything he had left behind. Maybe, Jake said finally, his voice distant. I don't know, but I can't let them hurt Lily. I can't let them destroy everything I've been trying to build. I've got to stop them. Pete gave a small nod, his eyes serious. All right then, we'll figure it out. Together. Jake looked over at Lily again, still resting on the couch. Her eyes were closed, but he could see the tension in her body. She was scared. He could see it in the way she curled up into the blanket, the way her hands were clasped tightly around it. She had every right to be scared, but Jake couldn't show her that he was afraid too. He had to be the strong one. For her. Stay here, Jake said, his voice steady. I'll be back. We'll get through this, I promise. Lily opened her eyes and met his gaze. There was no fear in them now, just a quiet understanding. I trust you, she said softly. Jake's heart swelled at her words, and for a moment, he almost let the emotion show. But he couldn't. He had to stay strong. He had to protect her. "I won't let you down," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll never let you down." With that, he turned and walked out of the garage, determined to find the answers he needed. He didn't know where this path would lead him, but he knew one thing for sure. He would do whatever it took to keep her safe, and whatever it took to stop the storm that was coming. Jake's mind raced as he stepped out of the garage, his boots crunching against the wet pavement. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that every moment he wasted brought them closer to finding Lily. The rain had stopped, but the danger hadn't. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way down the street, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of trouble. The night felt colder now, like a dark curtain closing in around him. Steele's crew had made it clear that they wouldn't stop until they had him back. They had their sights on him, and now they were after Lily too. Jake knew that he couldn't let them get to her. Not after everything. He had to find a way to end this, to put an end to the cycle of fear and violence that had haunted him for years. He couldn't do it alone. He needed to find the answers, to discover who was really behind this. It wasn't just Steele. There was something bigger, something darker. He had a feeling that the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it would get. But he couldn't stop now. He had to keep moving forward. He was no longer running from his past. He was facing it. As Jake walked, he felt the weight of his past pressing down on him. He had been part of the Hells Angels, a brotherhood that had shaped him into the man he was today. But that wasn't who he was anymore. He had walked away from that life, from the violence, from the chaos. He had made a choice to protect Lily, to give her a chance at a better life. And now, he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. As he turned the corner, Jake spotted a familiar figure standing by a parked car. It was Pete. He had been waiting for Jake, his face tense as he watched the street. "You all right?" Jake asked, his voice low. Pete nodded, but there was something in his eyes that Jake couldn't ignore. "I'm fine, but I've been thinking. We're not just dealing with Steele. This goes deeper. You know that, right?" Jake didn't need Pete to tell him that. He had known it from the start. Steele was just the beginning. There were people out there who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And Jake had become a target. "I know," Jake said, his voice tight. "I need to find out who's behind this. I can't let them hurt her." Pete looked around, his eyes scanning the shadows. "It's not just about protecting her anymore. It's about stopping them. If we don't act fast, it's going to get worse." Jake nodded. He knew the stakes were higher than ever. He wasn't just protecting Lily now. He was protecting his own future. "Where do we start?" Pete asked, stepping closer. "I need to know everything," Jake replied, his gaze sharp. "Everything about Steele and the people he's working with. There's got to be a connection somewhere." Pete hesitated for a moment before nodding. "All right, but we need to be careful. This isn't just some street gang. These guys are connected. They've got resources, and they won't hesitate to use them." Jake's jaw tightened. He had been part of that world once. He knew how ruthless it could be. But this time, he wasn't alone. He had Pete, and he had Lily. And that was enough to make him fight back. "We'll get them," Jake said, his voice low and determined. "I'm not running anymore. I'm going to make sure they never come after her again." As they walked down the street, the sound of their footsteps echoed in the silence. The world around them felt eerily calm, but Jake knew it was just the calm before the storm. There were still so many unanswered questions. But he had a plan now. He was going to find the answers. He was going to end this. They reached a small diner on the edge of town. It was a quiet place, tucked away from the chaos. The kind of place where no one asked questions, where people came to forget. Jake knew the owner. She owed him a favor. It was time to cash in. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and grease, the familiar scent of a place that had seen its fair share of late-night conversations. The owner, a woman named Marcy, looked up from behind the counter when Jake and Pete walked in. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice low. Jake gave her a nod. "I need information, and I need it now." Marcy studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing. She had known Jake for years, but she had never seen him like this. Something had changed in him. Something had shifted. "You're in deep this time, huh?" she said, stepping out from behind the counter. "I can't get involved in anything too crazy, Razor. You know that." Jake's eyes locked onto hers. "I'm not asking for your help. I'm asking for information." Marcy sighed, looking around the diner to make sure no one was listening. "Fine. I know some things. But you'd better be careful. There are people who would kill for this kind of information. Jake leaned in, his voice steady. I'll take the risk. Marcy nodded, then pulled a small notebook from her apron. She flipped through the pages, her fingers quick as she scanned the notes. Steele's not just a local problem. He's got ties to some heavy hitters. People with money, people with power. This isn't just about bikes or drugs. It's about control. They're trying to take over everything. Jake's heart raced as he absorbed the information. This wasn't just about the Hells Angels anymore. This was bigger, much bigger. And if he didn't act fast, it would consume everything. Where do we find them? Jake asked, his voice low. Marcy hesitated before giving him a name. There's a warehouse on the outskirts of town. It's a front for something bigger. They move things in and out, but no one knows what's really going on in there. Jake stood up, his mind made up. That's where we start. As he turned to leave, Marcy's voice stopped him. Be careful, Razor. This isn't just another fight. This is war. Jake didn't respond. He had no time for words. He had to stop this, no matter the cost. And this time, he wasn't going to run. Jake's hands tightened around the steering wheel as he drove through the night. The rain had returned, but it didn't matter anymore. The weight of what was ahead pressed down on him, but there was no turning back. They had a plan now, he and Pete. The warehouse on the outskirts of town was their destination. Marcy's information had been clear. This wasn't just a warehouse, it was a front. And behind the warehouse were the answers they needed. The questions were burning in Jake's mind. Who were these people really? What did they want? And how far would they go to get it? He had to know. For Lily. For his own redemption. The headlights cut through the night, illuminating the road ahead. Pete sat silently next to him, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Jake had always trusted Pete, and tonight wasn't any different. They were in this together now. It wasn't just about Jake anymore. They both knew that. It was about stopping whatever was coming and keeping Lily safe. Pete finally spoke, his voice calm, but with an edge of concern. You sure about this? Jake nodded, his jaw set. We have no choice. If we don't find out what they're really up to, we'll never get rid of them. Steele's just a small part of the bigger picture. This warehouse is where it all connects. Pete didn't argue. He understood what was at stake. The warehouse loomed ahead in the distance, a dark silhouette against the dimly lit horizon. The closer they got, the more Jake felt the pressure building. It wasn't just the danger of what they might find inside. It was the looming presence of his past, the very thing he had tried to leave behind. It felt like it was catching up with him, slowly but surely. As they pulled up to the entrance of the warehouse, Jake's heart rate quickened. They were here. This was it. He killed the engine, and for a moment, all that could be heard was the soft hum of the night. The tension was thick in the air. He looked over at Pete, who was already gearing up, checking his knife and his gun. They had to move fast. They had to be smart. They couldn't afford to be sloppy. Stay sharp, Jake whispered to Pete, who nodded in response. Together, they exited the truck, their movements quick but silent. The warehouse was surrounded by a high chain-link fence, but it was easy enough to slip through the gap in the corner. They moved swiftly, staying low, their feet light on the wet ground. As they approached the side of the building, Jake could see the faint glow of light through a small crack in the metal door. There was someone inside. He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the same feeling he used to get before a big fight. Only this time, there was more on the line than just his own survival. It was Lily. It was everything he had left. Pete motioned toward the door, signaling that he would take the left flank. Jake nodded and made his way around the other side, his heart pounding in his chest. He was ready. He had to be. He didn't know what was waiting for them inside, but he couldn't let fear hold him back. As he reached the door, he paused, listening carefully. The faint sound of muffled voices reached his ears. There were at least 2 people inside, maybe more. He glanced back at Pete, who gave him a small nod. It was time. Jake gently pushed the door open, the sound of the hinges creaking quietly in the stillness. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the shadows stretching long across the concrete floor. There were rows of crates stacked high, and the faint smell of oil and machinery filled the air. Jake's eyes adjusted to the darkness as he moved forward, every step calculated and deliberate. He had to find out what was going on here. He couldn't waste any more time. As he crept deeper into the warehouse, he spotted 2 figures standing near a table. One was flipping through a set of papers, while the other was on the phone. The man on the phone didn't sound pleased. "We need to move this shipment now," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't afford any more delays. If Razor shows up, we deal with him. No questions asked." Razor. The word hit Jake like a slap to the face. They were talking about him. He wasn't just the target anymore. He was the key. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. It was worse than he thought. They had been planning this. They had been waiting for him to make a move. And now, they were preparing for it. Pete moved quietly up behind him, his hand on Jake's shoulder to signal that he was in position. Jake nodded, his eyes still fixed on the two men at the table. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to act. He stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "You're not going anywhere." The two men spun around, their eyes widening in surprise. But it was too late. Pete was already on them, his knife flashing in the low light. Jake was right behind him, his hand reaching for his gun. "Who's pulling the strings?" Jake demanded, his voice cold. The man who had been on the phone held up his hands in surrender. "We don't know," he said, his voice shaking. "We're just following orders. Please, we don't want any trouble." Jake's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe him, but he couldn't waste time on these men. He needed answers. "Where's the shipment going?" Jake asked, his voice low and menacing. The man swallowed hard before speaking. "It's going to the docks. There's a ship leaving tonight. You won't catch it in time." Jake cursed under his breath. The docks. It was always the docks. He had to move fast. He had to stop whatever was happening before it was too late. He looked at Pete, who nodded, ready to go. "Get ready," Jake said, his voice determined. "We're not done yet." With that, they turned and raced toward the exit, the sounds of their footsteps echoing through the empty warehouse. The race against time had just begun. Jake's heart pounded as he and Pete raced toward the docks, the heavy rain making the pavement slick beneath their boots. Every step felt like it was taking them closer to something bigger than either of them could have anticipated. The warehouse had given them the information they needed, but it had also confirmed the worst. Steele and his crew were only pawns in a much larger game. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being played. The dock area loomed ahead, a maze of shipping containers and old warehouses stretching out into the dark, the only light coming from the flickering street lamps. Jake's eyes scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. His mind was running through every possible scenario. What if they were too late? What if this shipment was already gone, leaving them with nothing but questions and no answers? "We need to move fast," Pete said, his voice low but urgent. Jake nodded, his jaw set. He couldn't let his mind wander. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. They had to stop this. They had to stop whatever was being smuggled out of here. As they neared the first warehouse, Jake could hear the hum of machinery in the distance. It sounded like something big, something mechanical. Pete motioned to a narrow alley between two containers. "We go in through here," Pete said, his eyes scanning the shadows. Jake followed Pete into the alley, his mind focused. They moved quickly, silently, the only sound the rain and the soft thud of their footsteps on the wet concrete. They reached the back of the warehouse and found a small, locked door. Pete didn't hesitate. He pulled a set of tools from his pocket and quickly got to work, picking the lock with practiced ease. As the door creaked open, Jake's pulse quickened. They were in. The smell of diesel and metal hit them as they stepped inside, the warehouse dark and cold. The only light came from a few high windows, casting long shadows across the room. Jake motioned to Pete, signaling that they should split up. They couldn't afford to waste time looking around. Jake made his way toward the far side of the warehouse, his eyes scanning for anything unusual. There were rows of crates stacked high, but nothing that looked like it belonged in a normal warehouse. This wasn't just a shipment of goods. This was something more. He stopped in front of a large steel container, its lock still intact. Something about it felt off. Jake's instincts told him that this was it, that this container held whatever Steele and his crew had been hiding. He motioned for Pete to come over, his heart racing. Pete approached cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he examined the container. "This is it," Pete said quietly. "This is what we came for." But before Jake could respond, a loud noise echoed through the warehouse. The sound of a truck engine. The doors of the warehouse suddenly burst open, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. A convoy of black SUVs pulled in, their headlights cutting through the dark. The men inside were dressed in tactical gear, their movements swift and deliberate. They were ready for something. Ready for a fight. "We've got company," Pete hissed under his breath. Jake's hand instinctively went to the gun at his side. He wasn't ready for a fight. He hadn't planned for this. But as the truck stopped, the men inside began to unload crates and boxes, moving with military precision. Jake knew then that they were dealing with something much bigger than steel. This wasn't just a shipment of illegal goods. This was an operation. And they were the targets. "We have to move," Jake said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Pete didn't argue. They had no choice now. They had to stop whatever was happening, even if it meant going head-to-head with these men. They had to get to the bottom of it before it was too late. Jake and Pete took cover behind a stack of crates, watching as the men unloaded the truck. They had to act fast. The men didn't seem to notice them, too busy unloading the crates. But Jake could see the weapons being moved, the boxes marked with symbols he didn't recognize. He had no idea what was in them, but whatever it wasn't good. He took a deep breath. It was time to make his move. Jake motioned to Pete, signaling that they were going to take action. He didn't know how many men were inside, but he couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't let these people get away. He had already lost too much, and he wasn't about to lose Lily. Jake moved quickly, silently, his gun ready. Pete followed close behind, his eyes sharp as he kept watch. The two men snuck toward the containers, moving between them like shadows. When they reached the first row of boxes, Jake held up his hand, signaling Pete to stay low. He was close now. He could feel the tension in the air, the sense of danger creeping up on him. The men unloading the truck were unaware of the two intruders, but Jake knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. He just needed a few more seconds. He could hear the voices now, low murmurs in a foreign language. The men were speaking to each other as they unloaded the crates. Jake strained to listen, trying to catch a word, a clue that could lead them to the answers they needed. But before he could hear anything more, a sharp voice cut through the warehouse. "Who's there?" The men had noticed them. Jake's heart raced. The hunt had begun. The sharp voice echoed through the warehouse, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. The men unloading the crates had spotted them. In an instant, everything shifted. The quiet, methodical approach they'd had was gone. Now, they were in full-blown danger. Jake's eyes locked onto Pete's, and without a word, they sprang into action. Jake's hand went to his gun, but he didn't pull it out just yet. He needed to move fast, silently. Pete stayed low, following Jake's lead. They darted between the crates, staying out of sight, but the sounds of boots and voices growing louder told them they weren't going to get far without a fight. The men had begun to spread out, searching the shadows for any signs of intruders. Jake's breath was steady, his body instinctively moving in the practiced, silent manner of someone who had spent years in situations like this. But this wasn't like the club or the streets. This was something different. These men weren't just after him. They were after Lily. And that meant Jake wasn't going to back down. They couldn't let the men take control of the warehouse. Or worse, let them escape with whatever they were smuggling out. Jake's fingers tightened around the handle of his gun, but he held back. He had to keep his wits about him. The last thing they needed was to alert the rest of the crew. The first man rounded the corner of the crate, his flashlight cutting through the dark. Jake had no choice now. With a swift motion, Jake lunged forward, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. The flashlight fell to the floor with a loud clang, but the man barely had time to grunt before Jake had him pinned to the cold, hard concrete. "Stay down," Jake muttered through clenched teeth, his voice low but firm. He didn't want to kill anyone, but he wouldn't hesitate if it meant protecting Lily. The man struggled for a moment, but Jake's grip tightened, and soon enough, he was still. Pete moved forward, a determined look on his face. "Two down," Pete said, his voice steady, but Jake could hear the tension in it. They weren't out of the woods yet. Jake nodded, motioning for Pete to keep watch as he dragged the unconscious man behind a stack of crates. They didn't have time to deal with him right now. They had to keep moving. As they pressed on, the faint sound of voices reached them again. More men were coming. They had to hurry. "There's a back exit," Jake whispered, his mind already calculating the quickest route. "We need to make it there before they get more backup." Pete nodded without a word. The two men made their way toward the back of the warehouse, moving quietly and quickly. They passed more crates, some stacked high, others seemingly abandoned. The air was thick with the smell of diesel, metal, and dust. It was the kind of place that had seen a lot of illegal deals over the years, but none like this. None with people who would go this far. They reached the back door, but before Jake could open it, he heard another sound. A vehicle, its engine growling in the distance. Jake froze, his heart hammering in his chest. It was too late to escape. They were trapped. The men were closing in on them, and there was nowhere to run. But Jake wasn't going to panic. He couldn't. Not now. The only option was to fight. He turned to Pete, his voice low but urgent. "We don't back down. Not this time." Pete gave a brief nod, his eyes sharp and focused. "I'm with you." Jake pushed the door open, stepping into the night air. The sound of the engine was louder now, closer. They had to make it to cover before they were spotted. The night sky was overcast, the faint glow of city lights far in the distance. The rain had picked up again, but Jake didn't care. He didn't have time for it. The men were coming fast. He glanced at Pete, who was already crouching behind a stack of crates, ready to move. Jake followed him, his senses on high alert. They had no time to waste. They needed to disable the convoy before it had a chance to leave the warehouse. They couldn't let the shipment get away. The sound of the engine grew louder, and soon, Jake saw headlights shining through the gaps between the crates. The vehicles had arrived. A few men stepped out of the trucks, their boots hitting the wet ground with a heavy thud. Jake's breath caught in his throat. They were making their move. There was no more time for subtlety. Jake stepped forward, taking a deep breath, and raised his gun. He aimed for the first man's leg, firing just as the man was about to climb into the truck. The shot rang out, echoing across the empty space. The man collapsed to the ground, cursing and grabbing at his leg. Chaos erupted. The rest of the men scrambled, reaching for their weapons, but Jake and Pete were already on the move. They rushed forward, taking cover behind the trucks. Another shot rang out, and one of the men went down. The others were starting to scatter, but it was clear that they were outgunned and outnumbered. Jake felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he moved, the rush of battle replacing the panic. He had to finish this. They had to stop whatever was being smuggled out of here. He moved toward the trucks, his eyes scanning for any sign of the shipment. He couldn't let them get away. He couldn't let anyone else die because of this. The rest of the men were on the ground, and Jake's heart sank as he looked around. Pete had made sure the others were down. But there was still one thing left to do. He turned back to the trucks, his gun raised. The shipment. He had to stop it. The truck engines roared to life as Jake moved swiftly between the vehicles, his pulse racing with each step. He couldn't afford to hesitate now. He had to stop the shipment from leaving. There was no more room for error. As he approached the nearest truck, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Pete was close, moving, as silently as ever. But Jake's mind was already focused on the task at hand. They needed to shut this operation down, and fast. He reached the truck and carefully examined the cargo hold, his eyes scanning for anything that looked out of place. The back door was open just enough for him to peer inside. Boxes, crates, and sealed containers filled the space, but there was something more, something that didn't belong. Jake's heart skipped a beat as his eyes fell on a large container in the back of the truck. It was marked with a symbol he recognized, one that sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just contraband. This was a shipment for a bigger operation. This was a part of something much darker. Jake grabbed the edge of the container, his mind racing. He had to stop them before they got it out of here. He wasn't just fighting for his own life anymore. He was fighting for Lily's. He was fighting for everything he had left. He turned to Pete, who was crouched behind a nearby crate, keeping watch. "We need to move," Jake whispered, his voice tense. "They're not just smuggling goods. This is a larger operation." Pete's eyes narrowed as he nodded in agreement. "I knew it. But what's in that container?" Jake didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it couldn't get out of here. "We stop it now," Jake said firmly. He motioned for Pete to follow as he began to make his way toward the back of the warehouse. They had to get to the source. They had to find out who was really behind this operation, and they had to do it fast. The men in the trucks were starting to move, unloading the crates and preparing the shipment for departure. Jake could feel the pressure mounting. Every second that passed made it more likely they would lose their chance to stop them. He had to keep pushing forward. As they rounded a corner, Jake saw a group of men gathered near the exit, their backs turned as they discussed something in low voices. Jake froze, his heart racing. They were in the clear for now, but it wouldn't last. They had to make their move quickly before the men noticed them. He motioned for Pete to stay low as they crept closer. To the group. They were getting closer to the heart of the operation. Jake felt his breath quicken, the tension building with every step. He had to stop this. He couldn't let them get away with whatever they were planning. He had to find out what they were smuggling out of here, and who was behind it. They reached the corner of the warehouse, and Jake took a deep breath, preparing for the next step. The men were still engaged in conversation, unaware of the two intruders in their midst. Jake's eyes scanned the room, looking for any sign of an opening. He was ready to make his move. But just as he was about to step forward, the sound of a door opening caught his attention. A man stepped out from the shadows, his eyes immediately locking onto Jake's. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The man's face was familiar. Jake had seen him before. He was a higher-up in the operation, someone with connections to the very people Jake had been trying to get away from. The man's eyes narrowed, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. "I knew you'd show up sooner or later," the man said, his voice cold and calculated. "You really think you can stop this?" Jake's grip on his gun tightened, his body instinctively shifting into a defensive stance. "I don't care who you are," Jake growled, his voice low and dangerous. "This ends tonight." The man chuckled, his gaze shifting to Pete, who was still hiding behind a crate. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're outnumbered. You're too late." Jake's eyes flicked to the trucks, then back to the man. "I don't think I am." The man's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You've already lost. The shipment's leaving, and there's nothing you can do about it." Jake didn't flinch. He was done talking. He had spent too many years hiding from his past, too many years running from what he was meant to do. Tonight, he was going to face it head-on. Tonight, he was going to stop this. The man took a step forward, his hand reaching for his gun. But Jake was faster. He moved in a blur, his gun coming up to meet the man's chest before he had a chance to react. The shot rang out, echoing through the warehouse. The man crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with shock. Jake's heart raced, but he didn't pause. There was no time for hesitation. "Let's move," Jake said, turning to Pete. They had to keep going. The operation wasn't over. The shipment was still heading out, and Jake was determined to stop it. Pete followed close behind as they made their way deeper into the warehouse, the sound of the trucks still echoing in the distance. They had one chance to end this. One chance to stop the shipment before it left. Jake's mind was sharp as he moved, his focus unwavering. He couldn't afford to miss a step. They were getting closer, and Jake wasn't about to let them escape. Jake's mind raced as he and Pete moved deeper into the warehouse, the noise from the trucks growing louder as they drew closer to the source. His heart was pounding in his chest, the adrenaline surging through his veins. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just another fight. This was the final chance to stop whatever was happening here before it was too late. They had no time to waste. As they moved silently through the darkened aisles, the sound of the engines outside became deafening. The men were loading the last of the crates into the trucks. Jake knew they didn't have much time. The operation was on the brink of completion. Whatever they were smuggling out of here, it was nearly gone. "We need to make it to the front," Jake whispered to Pete, his voice steady, but filled with urgency. Pete nodded, his hand gripping the handle of his gun. They weren't going to let anyone escape this time. As they neared the main loading dock, Jake could see the shadows of the men, their figures moving in the dim light. The trucks were lined up, their engines idling, waiting for the final shipment. Jake's instincts kicked in, and he motioned for Pete to follow closely. They had to get to the front of the warehouse. The men weren't looking in their direction yet, but it wouldn't be long before they noticed the two intruders. Jake took a deep breath and began moving forward. The closer they got to the loading docks, the more intense the situation became. He could hear the faint sound of voices, low and muffled, but there was something else, a clinking sound, like metal on metal. The crates they had been loading were full of something. Jake was certain of it. But what? He had to find out. They had to stop this. He and Pete slipped between the shadows, moving toward the open doors at the front of the warehouse. The men were still focused on the trucks, unaware of the danger closing in on them. "We take them out quick," Jake whispered, his eyes narrowing. Pete gave a short nod, his face determined. They had no choice now. They couldn't let this operation succeed. The fate of everything rested on stopping it here and now. Jake crouched low, staying out of sight, as he and Pete positioned themselves behind a stack of crates near the entrance. His hand gripped his gun tightly, his mind running through the steps they needed to take. The first man at the truck was checking the cargo, his back turned. Jake didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly, stepping forward and catching the man off guard. The man barely had time to react before Jake had him in a chokehold, pulling him into the shadows. The man struggled, but Jake's grip was firm, and in seconds, he was unconscious. Pete had already moved on to the next man, using the same swift technique to disable him before he could alert anyone else. They were working in sync now, a well-oiled machine. Jake's eyes flicked to the trucks, where the remaining men were still loading the last of the crates. There were more of them than he had expected, but it didn't matter. They were too focused on their work to notice the two intruders slipping through the shadows. As they reached the final truck, Jake's pulse quickened. He could see the crates being loaded into the back, but this time, it was different. The containers they were using were bigger, bulkier, and something about them didn't sit right with Jake. His instincts told him that this was the moment. They had to stop this shipment before it was too late. He motioned to Pete, signaling him to stay back. Pete nodded, understanding immediately. Jake moved forward, his hand steady as he grabbed the handle of the crate closest to him. He pulled it open carefully, just enough to see inside. What he found made his blood run cold. Inside, the crate was something far more dangerous than he had imagined. High-powered weapons, ammunition, and several packages wrapped in black plastic. It was clear now. This wasn't just smuggling illegal goods. This was a full-scale operation, one that involved far more than Jake had originally thought. He could feel the weight of it now. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just about protecting Lily. It was about stopping a much bigger threat. They weren't just dealing with Steele and his crew. They were dealing with an underground network of people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And now, Jake was in the middle of it. He couldn't back down. He had to stop it. He slammed the crate shut and signaled to Pete. "We need to shut this down. Now." Pete moved swiftly, his face grim. "What's in the crates?" Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew it was bad. They needed to take the men out, but it wasn't just about that anymore. They had to stop this shipment, and they had to do it before anyone had a chance to leave. Jake turned to face the loading dock. He could see the remaining men moving toward the trucks, getting ready to leave. They had to act fast. He stepped forward, his gun raised, ready for what was next. But before he could make his move, the sound of a door slamming open caught his attention. A voice called out from behind him. "Freeze." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He turned to see a man in black gear, his gun pointed straight at Jake. The man was tall, his face obscured by a helmet. Jake didn't have time to think. He dove to the side, rolling behind a stack of crates as the man fired. The bullet whizzed past, narrowly missing him. Pete took cover behind another crate, firing back as the man ducked for cover. "We've got company," Pete shouted. Jake's mind raced. This wasn't over. They had to finish this now, or it would all be for nothing. He peeked around the crate, his gun aimed at the man's position. This was the final showdown. They couldn't let the shipment get away. Jake took a deep breath, preparing himself for what was to come. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about stopping them once and for all. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched behind the crates, listening to the sound of gunfire and shouting all around him. Pete was already moving, staying low and using the cover to his advantage. But Jake knew this wasn't going to be easy. They had to finish this now. They had to end it before more people got hurt. The man in black gear who had fired at them was still behind his cover, but Jake wasn't about to let him stay there for long. With a quick movement, Jake peeked out from behind the crate, his gun raised and aimed at the man's position. The man fired again, the bullet whizzing past Jake's ear, but he wasn't fazed. Jake squeezed the trigger, the shot hitting the man square in the shoulder. The man dropped to the ground, cursing as he clutched his wound. Pete moved in, covering Jake as he approached the fallen man. "You're not going anywhere," Jake said, keeping his gun trained on the man's head. The man didn't move, his hands raised in surrender. "Please," the man groaned, blood dripping from his shoulder. "We're just doing our jobs. We didn't know who you were." Jake didn't buy it. He knew better than to trust anyone in this business. "Who's in charge?" Jake demanded. The man didn't answer at first, his face contorted in pain. But after a few moments, he finally spoke. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low. "There's someone above us. A shadow, pulling all the strings. He's not someone you want to mess with." Jake's pulse quickened. This was bigger than Steele. This was the person behind it all. The one who had been orchestrating everything from the start. Where is he? Jake asked, his voice low and steady. The man shook his head, his eyes darting nervously. I don't know, he whispered. He's always a step ahead. Always hiding. Jake's frustration mounted. I don't have time for this, he muttered. Tell me where he is. Before the man could answer, Pete grabbed him by the collar and yanked him up to his feet. We're not playing games here. You tell us where to find him, or we'll make you regret it, Pete said, his voice full of menace. The man winced, but he finally spoke again, his words barely a whisper. The docks. There's a private hangar, hidden behind the warehouse. That's where he's been running everything. That's where you'll find him. Jake's eyes narrowed. The docks. Of course. It all made sense now. He had to go there. He had to finish this. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everything that had been taken from him, and for Lily's safety. Take him out, Jake said to Pete, his voice cold. Pete didn't hesitate. With a swift movement, Pete's knife flashed through the air, silencing the man before he could speak again. Jake's eyes didn't leave the body as it fell to the ground. He didn't have time for regrets. Not now. Not when the enemy was so close. Let's move, Jake said, his voice hard. Pete nodded, and they both quickly moved toward the back of the warehouse. As they reached the docks, the rain had started to come down harder, the sound of it hammering against the metal roofs of the nearby warehouses. The private hangar was just ahead, a massive structure tucked away from the main shipping lanes. Jake could feel the tension building in his chest. This was it. This was where it would all end. He knew the risk. He knew the cost. But he wasn't going to stop. Not until he had answers. They crept toward the hangar, keeping low and out of sight. The faint sound of voices echoed through the walls. Jake signaled for Pete to stay back as he approached the door, the cold metal beneath his fingertips. He could hear the sound of machinery inside, the hum of engines, the clatter of crates being moved. He took a deep breath, readying himself for what was coming. With a swift motion, Jake kicked the door open, the metal door slamming against the wall with a loud crash. Inside, the hangar was alive with activity. Men in tactical gear were unloading crates, moving them quickly and efficiently. But as soon as they saw Jake, everything froze. You're too late, a voice called out from across the room. Jake's eyes locked onto the figure standing at the far end of the hangar. The man was tall, wearing a black suit and a cold, calculating expression. He was the one Jake had been looking for. You must be the one pulling the strings, Jake said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. The man smiled, his eyes cold. I've been expecting you, he said, stepping forward. You've caused quite a bit of trouble. But it's over now. You don't get to stop this. Jake didn't flinch. He didn't back down. I'm not here to negotiate, he said, his gun aimed at the man's chest. I'm here to end this. The man's smile faltered for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. You think you can stop me? You think you can stop all of this? He sneered, motioning toward the crates of weapons and the men surrounding them. You're just one man. Jake's eyes hardened. One man who's had enough. He squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing in the massive hangar. The man dropped to the ground, his eyes wide with shock. The men around him hesitated, but they didn't have time to react. Pete was already on them, taking them out one by one. The rest of the men tried to scramble, but it was too late. The operation was over. Jake stepped forward, his gun still raised, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He had done it. He had stopped them, but it didn't feel like a victory. Not yet. There was still more to do. He had to get Lily out of there, and he had to make sure no one ever came after her again. He turned to Pete, who was already moving toward the exit. Let's go, Jake said, his voice low. We're not done yet. Together, they walked out of the hangar, leaving the wreckage behind them. The storm was still raging, but it felt like a new chapter was beginning. Jake knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a chance to protect what mattered. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him.